Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. Baruch Spinoza, one of the most significant and controversial Jewish thinkers of all time, was far more influential in death than he was in life. In the decades and centuries following his passing, the shadow of Spinoza's writings hung over Jewish and Christian intellectuals across Europe. Some saw him as a hero, a foundational thinker who opened new horizons, whereas others reviled him as a dangerous heretic who threatened the stability of faith and society. The story of how Jewish thinkers and writers have wrestled with the legacy of Spinoza, the ways in which they have resurrected him in order to embrace or damn him, reveals much about the course of modern Judaism, and it is this process that we shall be discussing today. This is the third and final installment on our mini-series on Spinoza, following our episodes with Rebecca Goldstein and Yitzchak Melamed, and we hope you have enjoyed and gained insights from our discussion. To discuss the 4 centuries of Spinoza's reception among the Jews, we are pleased today to welcome Dr. Daniel Schwartz, Professor of History and Judaic Studies at George Washington University. He has written widely on Judaism in the early modern period, and his 2012 book at the center of our discussion today, titled The First Modern Jew, Spinoza and the History of an Image, was the co-winner of the 2012 Salo W Prize for the Best First Book in Jewish Studies and a finalist of the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. We are delighted to welcome Professor Schwartz to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Pleased to have you here, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me on this podcast.
Excellent. Let's get right to it. So the title of your book depicts Spinoza as the first modern Jew. That's how you phrased it. And I just would like to ask you, what exactly is meant by that? I mean, to what degree was Spinoza different in a way that we hadn't seen before, and that he was modern in a way that nobody else was prior to him?
So, I'm going to answer that question in kind of 2 parts. Because the title of the book notwithstanding, I'm making a somewhat different argument. But in terms of why, is Spinoza often seen as the first modern Jew, I would say the most common answer would focus on Spinoza's reaction to his excommunication by, the Sephardic Congregation of Amsterdam in 1656. Scholars continue to debate exactly why Spinoza was excommunicated. If he were saying things similar to what he would later argue in the Theological Political Treatise, one of his most famous works, then, I think his excommunication would be no mystery whatsoever. But, we don't know exactly what precipitated his excommunication, and there are various theories. But significant is how Spinoza responded, to that excommunication. What he essentially did was repudiate this kind of either or that typically confronted the Jewish excommunicate in pre-modern times, which was that you kind of had 2 choices. Either you converted to another religion, typically the dominant religion, or you would try to patch things up with the community by doing some kind of penance, some kind of atonement in order to be brought back into the fold. Now, Spinoza's writ of excommunication is already pretty sweeping. It's hard to kind of, in reading that, see, what kind of ground there was for any reconciliation. But that one notwithstanding, what's significant is about Spinoza, I think, is that he kind of rejects this either or. He says, I'm not going to convert. It seems like he does affiliate, with some nonconformist Christian groups, but he never appears to go through any kind of actual conversion. And in fact, rejects a later attempt by a Catholic scholar, a Catholic person who he had tutored to kind of get him to convert. But at the same time, he maintains total distance from the Jewish community. So he kind of opts to kind of exist as an individual without kind of any religious communal attachments. And so, people have often seen in that, in kind of his refusal to convert, but also his refusal in some ways to, kind of submit to the authority of the community as is indicative of a kind of incipient modernity. So there are other reasons too, but I would just say that in some ways, what I was interested in my book was less so making a case for whether Spinoza was the first modern Jew or not, than in some ways kind of exploring that kind of idea and how that idea evolved. Because of course, like for Spinoza himself, like an idea like a modern Jew would just not have meant anything to him. I mean, I don't, he wouldn't really have understood that. So what I was interested mainly is in kind of seeing the function that this idea had played and how Spinoza came to be seen as a prototype of modern Jewish identity. And not only that, but as kind of a forerunner of very different interpretations of what being a modern Jew would mean.
Well, I suppose it makes a lot of sense that the very first modern Jew wouldn't be able to express the fact that he was the first modern Jew, given that it hadn't been invented in his time and would be used as the prototype, which brings me to my next question, which is that, is this the reason why Spinoza's image and Spinoza's writings has been so frequently and so with such great interest and animosity dug up and discussed and debated? Because what you've demonstrated in your work is how often this occurred. I mean, generation after generation after generation, the figure of Spinoza is once again excavated by philosophers, by novelists, by poets, by national ideologues, by everyone, and discussed and debated back and forth. And I guess the question becomes, what is the source of this intense interest with this man? Yes, philosophically, he certainly wrote interesting works, but I suppose the question would be, is this element of him being the first modern Jew, of not quite fitting in as a Jew, but also not converting to Christianity, just living as a private citizen in a modern state, was that the principal reason why he was so focused on for centuries and centuries? Or what other reasons are there? What is the nature of the challenge that Spinoza posed, such that everyone had to dig him up and pronounce their opinion on him for good or for ill?
Good question. Well, I mean, there are many who see kind of and have presented Spinoza as a kind of, table setter, so to speak, for modern Jewish thought. In other words, that he kind of posed the challenges that later Jewish thinkers would have to kind of wrestle with in order to justify an embrace of philosophy at the same time as you kind of insisted on a kind of continued significance of Jewish particularity in some form or another. So, the late Hebrew University philosopher Eliezer Schweid was particularly important in terms of advancing this kind of approach to studying modern Jewish thought. In essence, all these later figures are kind of engaging with the challenges that Spinoza had posed. And these challenges were wide-ranging, I should say. A challenge, most fundamentally perhaps, a challenge that Judaism retained any kind of raison d'etre after the loss of a sovereign or semi-sovereign state in antiquity. In other words, this idea that what he calls the ceremonial law or halakha, that this was essentially a political law that was relevant only so long as there was some kind of state. It didn't have any kind of like deeper spiritual significance. And so, Spinoza's basically saying diaspora Judaism really, kind of retains no meaning. There's no reason for it to continue to exist. There are many other challenges in terms of biblical criticism, in terms of other things he has to say about Jewish law, in terms of his kind of approach to the understanding of prophecy. That idea, that which is expressed in chapter 3 of the treatise, that there really isn't any reason why people should still be clinging to this religion. I think that gets at the heart of the fundamental challenge that Jewish philosophers felt they had to answer. But I do think, and to go back to the broader question, I think I would argue. I mean, look, there are various aspects of Spinoza that have engaged readers of all kinds, not just Jewish, obviously. I think that in terms of understanding why Spinoza, came to loom so large, I do feel that it was driven to some extent by a kind of genealogical imperative. In other words, that it starts in some ways with an attempt of later Jews who are drifting away from the community, who are moving away from the practice of Jewish law to kind of understand who am I and where do I come from, and to look to Spinoza as a kind of point of origin.
Interesting. So what you're saying, what it seems to me, is that Spinoza can function as two things: either, as you say, a point of origin, or an ultimate counterexample, a progenitor of ideas against which modern Jewish thinkers, must wrestle. So, he's a point both of inspiration and of opposition, I suppose.
Yeah. So I would say exactly, and I would distinguish this as those who maybe see Spinoza as not just the first modern Jew, but in some ways exemplary. In other words, the first modern Jew, perhaps the first modern Jewish thinker, and as a kind of positive figure in that regard, as opposed to those who see him as kind of having laid down the gauntlet that, kind of later Jewish thinkers, in order to kind of justify kind of the continued relevance of Judaism, would have to answer in some respect or another. And yes, I think this is an approach that you see in somebody like Eliezer Schweid, who was quite clear that he saw Spinoza, as kind of having left, but that the questions he posed were critical in terms of kind of origins of modern Jewish philosophy.
Right. If I wanted to use a metaphor, the Spinoza slamming of the door,
Yes.
the echoes still reverberate.
Yes, he in fact uses that. I mean, he uses that very phrase in one of his works from 1974 that, Spinoza kind of slammed the door.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Or
Right.
something like that.
I remember I did my undergraduate in Shalem College in Israel, and I had a very brilliant teacher of modern Jewish thought called Eli Scheinfeld, a young philosopher, sort of French-Israeli. So he taught us a course in modern Jewish philosophy, which was, the usual suspects, Mendelssohn and Rosenzweig and Cohen and the others. But he started off with a session on Spinoza, and started off with this line, and his heavily accented Hebrew. He said, "Kulanu tzetzaav shel Spinoza b'yod'im u'velo yod'im." All of us are descendants of Spinoza, whether we're aware of it or not. And that line, you're certainly stuck with me. And again, if you read many accounts like Schwartz and others of modern Jewish thought, so yes, Spinoza is that starting point, because he's the figure against which so many struggle. I want to get onto a few specific moments within the history of Spinoza's reception in Judaism, and then talk about that. Before we do it, perhaps you could lay out a little bit of the more general picture of how Spinoza was received among general European Christian intellectuals, let's say, for a couple centuries after his death, because much like with the Jews, he was by many reviled, let's say, but by some revered. So could you perhaps elaborate a little on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, there's growing kind of agreement that Spinoza is a crucial figure in the Enlightenment, which has not always necessarily been espoused. I mean, one of the most kind of far-reaching arguments for his significance in the past 2 decades has been, this historian, Jonathan Israel, starting in 2001 in this book, Radical Enlightenment, basically made a kind of argument that, in terms of how we approach the Enlightenment, there had been kind of previously a dominant trend in the last quarter of the 20th century toward increasingly distinguishing between different like national enlightenments. And, Israel was trying to push back against this by seeing, certain larger patterns transnationally. And what he focused on was, what he saw as this kind of like fundamental divide between what he called moderate enlightenment and radical enlightenment. And that whereas moderate enlightenment, might be critical of religion in certain respects, in favor of greater degree of tolerance, but that ultimately it was more of an attempt to kind of reconcile reason and religion in some fashion, or not, necessarily to kind of take these Enlightenment ideas and, argue for revolutionary political and religious change, as opposed to this radical Enlightenment that was more extreme in its call and its break with religion, certainly with political religion, and also in terms of like later arguing for, kind of ideas like genuine democracy. And so, Israel kind of made Spinoza into the principal hero inspiration thinker of radical enlightenment. So that has been a fairly influential thesis. I think Israel's tendency to divide things into kind of very clear-cut camps is open to challenge. I'm not convinced by it, but nevertheless, I mean, there have been works over the years that have looked at Spinoza's influence in terms of clandestine ideas during the Enlightenment. He is a figure whom most feel compelled to repudiate, because he's seen as this kind of atheist par excellence, as somebody that if you're going to kind of argue for enlightenment in some sense, you better distance yourself from, because you might be labeled a Spinozist, which means basically that you're an atheist, that you're a materialist. So, I mean, he's remains mostly a controversial, marginal figure. But yes, I mean, I think, already there is this, there is an idea that Spinoza is influencing these radical currents in enlightenment to some degree, perhaps not to the degree that Jonathan Israel argues, but, nevertheless, is important in terms of kind of seeding some of the more far reaching criticisms of religion and the old regime.
I would say perhaps one of the extraordinary changes over the intellectual life in Europe in the last centuries is that, in the century or two after Spinoza's death, to be labeled a Spinozist was essentially a kiss of death in polite intellectual circles. You were then down as a heretic, whereas by the time you reach the 20th century, figures like Einstein and others saying, yes, I'm a Spinozist, that's a label that they wear proudly. So let's move on to the first of these, I would say, flashpoints in the history of Spinoza's reception among the Jews, which is also a major flashpoint of his acceptance or reception among European intellectuals in general, which is the pantheism controversy of the late 18th century. It's actually one of my favorite intellectual episodes. It's very interesting and the characters are fascinating. So could you perhaps, I mean, it's complex, but give us briefly an overview of what the controversy was about, who was involved in it, and how this relates to the Jewish reception of Spinoza?
Sure. And, I entirely agree with you, JJ. I think there's some kind of, whether it's novelistic or dramatic version, of the pantheism controversy that I can envision, just because it really kind of combines some very personal issues in terms of relationships, in terms of religion, with larger philosophical questions. Okay, so this pantheism controversy, which kind of breaks out in German philosophical circles in the 1780s, kind of initially is kind of based on a dispute between Moses Mendelssohn, right, this leading figure in both, the German and the Jewish Enlightenments, and a German kind of anti-rationalist thinker who, might be seen as foreshadowing Romanticism in some respects, named Friedrich Jacobi. And it kind of initially centers on, Jacobi's claim in a letter to Mendelssohn that he had been, with, Mendelssohn's famous friend and, one of the great figures of the German Enlightenment, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, toward his death, and that, Lessing essentially revealed to Jacobi that, there is kind of no God, save Spinoza's God. In other words, Spinoza, basically kind of an embrace of Spinozism. And so, this kind of becomes the issue at stake between Mendelssohn and Jacobi, in that, Jacobi sees this as kind of very useful to him, because it's not that Jacobi cares so much about Spinoza per se, but he certainly knows what the implications of saying, that somebody is a Spinozist. And so what he really wants to do is challenge, the kind of legitimacy of any kind of rationalist Enlightenment philosophy whatsoever, by showing that it inevitably, through its kind of compulsion for explaining everything, conceptualizing things, kind of subsuming everything under abstract principles, that this kind of inevitably leads to a kind of determinism that leads to Spinoza. And so Mendelssohn, in some ways, sees his role as kind of both trying to kind of defend Lessing, but also, kind of parrying this critique of the Enlightenment. And so, Mendelssohn writes this work called in German Morgenstunden, or morning hours, which is, not just related to this, but what he kind of tries to do there, building on something he had already kind of initiated in his first work from the 1754, the Philosophical Dialogues, was to try to show ways in which Spinoza could be saved for theism, even while rejecting Spinoza's philosophy in many respects, including what he saw as kind of this kind of like the lack of a kind of irreducible gap between God and the world. Nevertheless, he tries to argue that one could see Spinoza as not so much as arguing for some kind of like extra mundane God, as for the existence of a world outside of God. In other words, something that would approach what some scholars sometimes will call panentheism as opposed to pantheism, in order, kind of seeing the world as inhering within God as opposed to separate, or moving toward an idea of what the philosopher Solomon Maimon would later call acosmism, and that would be taken up later by Hegel. And that one of your earlier guests for the series, Yitzhak Malamed, has really explored this kind of a cosmic idea. So he tries to kind of like save Spinoza in some ways, even while trying to clearly lay out, some differences. So then, Jacobi had been involved in this long correspondence with Mendelssohn, trying to kind of understand Lessing, to argue over Lessing. So, Jacobi totally pulls the rug out from under Mendelssohn by publishing all these letters and publishing his discussions with Lessing. And then Mendelssohn feels kind of compelled to answer that again and dies shortly thereafter. In any case, what basically happens is that this spawns a tremendous interest in Spinoza among German thinkers in particular, that leads to a real revision of his image, where for many of these kind of late German Enlightenment thinkers, early Romantic thinkers, Spinoza goes from being this kind of atheist par excellence to what the philosopher and poet Novalis called a God-intoxicated man, viewing Spinoza as kind of somebody who, because like he is using words like God, because of a kind of increasing kind of focus on a kind of pantheism or panentheism, is seen as kind of reconciling modern thought with a kind of religious spiritual dimension. And so he comes to be seen as the crucial figure in philosophy, even if later figures still see the need to criticize or reject Spinoza. So, Hegel famously has this idea that all philosophy begins with Spinoza. In other words, similar to Schweid in Jewish thought, Hegel's arguing basically that everybody has to answer Spinoza. But he does try to kind of distance himself from what he sees as Spinoza's overly static system, his kind of inability to kind of have a motion in his system, to integrate the infinite and the finite in a way that Hegel proposed to do. And there is some Judaizing of Spinoza that goes along with this. But I think you could say that this is where you see a real beginnings of a kind of rehabilitation of Spinoza, and that in itself creates a crucial foundation for understanding one dimension, not the only reason, but one explanation for why an increasing number of Jewish intellectuals begin to kind of look to Spinoza and consider his significance, not just in terms of modernity broadly speaking, but for the Jewish modernity specifically.
Interesting. It's been explained to me that the protagonists in the pantheism controversy at the end of the 18th century, that their works on Spinoza or their discussions of it sort of backfired, because they present him as, or at least Jacobi to a certain extent, presents him as a thinker whose thought does in fact underwrite much of the Enlightenment project, but therefore we have to reject it and reject the Enlightenment project and go back to more traditional principles of religion. Whereas many who were reading this and who came after, such as Hegel, such as Goethe and others, realized, hang on one second, no, we need to reject the religious principles and embrace the Spinozist element.
Yes, no, absolutely. There's a tremendous irony. Yeah, there's a tremendous irony in that both, certainly Jacobi, but Mendelssohn as well. I mean, weren't interested in any kind of broad Spinoza revival.
No, not in the slightest.
And yet the pantheism controversy kind of stimulated just that.
There is this mythology as well that Moses Mendelssohn died while
Yes.
trying to answer. In other words, Jacobi publishes the letters, and then Mendelssohn's desperate to respond, and runs out into the Berlin snow to the publishing house to try and print his letters, to try and print his response or something, and then catches a cold and dies
That's
or
right.
something. This seems to be a myth, but it's a myth that Mendelssohn's desperation to respond to Spinoza brought about his own demise, which is certainly interesting in of its own self. I want to remain with Mendelssohn's response to Spinoza because, of course, Mendelssohn, in many ways, is the progenitor or the first major example of modern Jewish thought, of a Jewish thinker who explicitly grapples and wrestles with elements of modernity, be that parts of religion, parts of philosophy, parts of political thought. And it's quite clear there are two Mendelssohns, and Mendelssohn had this throughout his life. There was Mendelssohn, the philosopher, who wrote general philosophy, who wrote works that were supposed to be read by everyone. And there was Mendelssohn the Maskil, the Jewish enlightener, the one who wrote works in Hebrew, the one who wrote, who spearheaded the project of the new Pirush HaTorah, the Biur, and who was essentially interested in Jewish subjects. And what's interesting is that Mendelssohn confronts Spinoza really in both spheres, because he has to confront Spinoza as a great philosopher, but also confront Spinoza as an antagonist towards Judaism, which Spinoza's philosophy undoubtedly was. So could you maybe talk a little bit about this, the sort of Mendelssohnian response to Spinoza? To what extent was he responding to him as a European Enlightenment philosopher trying to grapple with a predecessor? And to what extent was he responding to him as a Jew who saw Spinoza's works as inimical to Judaism to a certain degree?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I certainly think you could say that Mendelssohn, really up until the last decade of his life, the 1780s, really tries to keep these kind of two aspects of his philosophical work, the more general kind of engagement, with kind of European German philosophy and, kind of this incipient kind of Haskalah. He really tries to keep them somewhat separate. And in some ways, what happens is that toward, the end of his life, just before or during, in some ways, the pantheism controversy, really just before, but he is kind of feels compelled to write, what is often considered this kind of foundational work in modern Jewish thought, Jerusalem, because he's trying to answer the critique of those who are saying, Spinoza, because Mendelssohn had already come out very clearly against the idea of religion as coercive, which in and of itself, even though he doesn't mention Spinoza in that context, would seem to kind of vitiate the excommunication. But now he feels like he has to make a case for, if I'm going to reject the idea of like religious coercion, which so many associate with Judaism. I mean, Kant would develop this term, but, like a heteronomous law, kind of externally imposed law that was originally kind of, at least, and, to be honest, still, although Mendelssohn kind of ignored this, remained an element of the self-governing Jewish community, and well into, in some places, the 18th and even 19th century. So, what he does there is he tries to make a case for Judaism against this critique. And so one of his famous arguments there is that there's a way of trying to kind of reject the idea that Judaism claims any kind of exclusive truths, like any kind of monopoly on truth that is only gained through revelation, as a way of challenging Christianity. Mendelssohn argues that Judaism essentially is a revealed legislation, that it focuses primarily on acts and precepts rather on, kind of dogmas or beliefs. Now, people have seen already in this idea of, Judaism as kind of fundamentally legislative, fundamentally about the law, perhaps some kind of direct engagement with Spinoza, who, in some ways says something similar, except that unlike Spinoza, who's going to focus on this and say that, this ceremonial law, as he calls it, was only valid so long as the ancient, Jewish commonwealth stood, Mendelssohn's going to make a case for its, continuing binding authority, even if he argues that no longer a coercive authority. So, you do see here, like, an attempt to kind of where kind of Mendelssohn kind of begins to try to defend Judaism against some of the major currents, within German Enlightenment thought. Thinking about his relationship to Spinoza, it's very complicated. I mean, because It often gets overlooked, certainly within, among many people who encounter Mendelssohn simply in a Jewish philosophy course, that Mendelssohn had played a very important role, in this first work that he kind of writes, although it's really published by Lessing without Mendelssohn's knowledge, but called the Philosophical Dialogues, that seem to have been based on Mendelssohn's discussions with Lessing about Spinoza, that he really is the first to try to kind of redeem him by making him, into this kind of crucial, if ultimately wrong-headed figure who kind of mediates between Descartes and Leibniz. If this idea of kind of Leibniz's what's called pre-established harmony, became, really a kind of dominant element framework in 18th century German Enlightenment thought, he was almost trying to show that Spinoza had paved the way for this. And he also really speaks of Spinoza very flatteringly, calls him a kind of martyr for truth. So, Mendelssohn both kind of rehabilitating Spinoza, then trying to kind of, reject a critique that seems influenced by Spinoza. He kind of oscillates between the two.
Which is exactly what makes the relationship between them so fascinating. It's been written on so many times, and justifiably so, because on the one hand, one cannot get out of the Spinozan critique, or one cannot escape the force of it, but also one cannot leave it unanswered if one wants to paint a coherent picture of Judaism that also dovetails with principles of modern philosophy, which certainly Mendelssohn does. So let us move from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, because that's where you go next. So we have famously the Western European Haskalah in the latter decades of the 18th century. And then you have the Napoleonic Wars, which more or less last till 1815. And then in the early to mid decades of the 19th century, you have the Central or Eastern European Haskalah. And also there, Spinoza is frequently discussed, but often with a great deal of antagonism and hostility and vituperation. So before we get onto the figure who tries to defend him and sort of repurpose him, as it were, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Spinoza's more hostile reception within the Eastern Haskalah, and who we're talking about, who writes about him, and what are the objections leveled by those members of the Eastern Haskalah, and why is it different, possibly, to what was going on in Berlin decades earlier?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think, in some ways I see Spinoza as kind of far more important within, what we might call the East European Haskalah. Although often even these kind of like regional divides are, a little problematic, because sometimes these were like trans-regional, at least, conversations, I mean, you do see, certain kind of incipient efforts to kind of rethink Spinoza, by figures like, in the German Haskalah, the earlier Central European Haskalah, like Isaac Oeschel, certainly by Maimon himself, to the degree to which one considers him part of the Haskalah. But as a figure of discussion and really controversy, he becomes much more kind of central within the East European Haskalah. I would actually say that really, I mean, there certainly were more moderate Maskilim who opposed Spinoza. But the person who really kind of emerges as the principal opponent of Spinoza and Spinozism, within maybe what we would call like the Hebrew Enlightenment, is this Italian Jewish rabbi, biblical scholar, poet, really major intellectual, Samuel David Luzzatto, or as he's often referred to, Shadal. He is the one who is the main polemicist against Spinoza and his recuperation, within Jewish thought, within Hebrew literature specifically. And part of it has to do with the fact that, Shadal was very opposed to rationalist philosophy. He was kind of like I mean, he wasn't really a philosopher. He was very much anti-rationalist. And he saw rationalist philosophy as kind of fundamentally alien to Judaism rightly understood. That he called it kind of like Atticism, that it was from the Greeks, not the Jews. And felt that the real kind of, I mean, there's something of a kind of, Yehuda Halevi aspect of of Shadal in terms of, trying to kind of emphasize the preeminence of a kind of biblical idea of, of God and Judaism, um, with this idea of, really the importance of a kind of divine personalism, the importance of a kind of ethics that, he sees as, kind of having much stronger foundations within Judaism than within, let's say, philosophy. Shadal had already been quite critical of Maimonides and any kind of recuperation of Maimonides within the Haskalah. Ibn Ezra for the more philosophical aspects of his biblical commentary. But Spinoza becomes like the, epitome of this. And so he rails against these figures who are trying to reclaim Spinoza. And in fact, one of, the arguments that Shadal makes against Spinoza has to do with this idea of pity.
Right. For Shadal, ethics and ethical sensibility was the very heart of his worldview.
Yes, very exactly. And, Spinoza in the ethics, one of the arguments he makes is that pity is a bad thing, right? Rachamim essentially is a bad thing. And why? In other words, he basically argues that pity is, a negative kind of passion that doesn't lead to kind of the, greater flourishing, of the self. He sees it also as somewhat passive. And, Shadal, he sees, pity, compassion as the very core of Judaism, right? That the idea of acting compassionately, like this is fundamentally what it means to walk in God's ways and in God's footsteps. So really he becomes the main polemicist. And, certainly there are those within Eastern Europe, who recoil against any kind of engagement with Spinoza. Certainly within the yeshivot, even the famous yeshivot of Volozhin, etc. But yeah, I think, Shadal's interesting in that he really is the, main opponent. And he comes from this Italian Jewish world that is by no means, all that similar to Eastern Europe. I would just add, like, if we want to look, often people look at like Austria and Galicia, and then this kind of migration into Russia. One of the things that really differentiates the Haskalah in this environment is that opposed to in, the German states, German cities, or even people have argued for an Italian Haskalah. David Ruderman famously argued for a kind of English Haskalah. But in all those cases, it was basically, kind of a movement of a Jewish minority. Okay. And so what's different in Eastern Europe is that many of these figures are living still within a kind of predominantly Jewish world and Jewish environment. And so the idea of making a more particularist claim to Spinoza is not as problematic, I would say.
So on that note, let's move on to the man defending him, or the man presenting the Spinozistic case, let's say, within the Eastern European Haskalah. And I have to say, I'm very grateful you brought him to my attention, because before I read your book, I actually barely knew of his existence, but he's a really, really fascinating individual and certainly accomplished for his time. So tell us a little bit about Solomon Rubin and, well, firstly, a brief overview of his life and works, but also how and why does he seek to rehabilitate Spinoza and present him better within the Jewish context, let's say. What is his main Spinoza's project within the context of this Eastern Haskalah?
Right. So, Rubin, there is an interesting life story, although, we know it only really through one biography that was written about him in German, in the early 20th century. But, like he had this experience of many a maskil, like this kind of archetypal experience of, it's kind of like a traditional education, but then, discovering, through reading Haskalah texts, like the Guide of the Perplexed, which is famously, kind of rehabilitated, or a very important text was actually, Maimon's, it's a work that was written in Hebrew called Givat HaMoreh, which was a commentary on the Guide to the Perplexed, but really was, a very loose commentary. That was his way of kind of putting forward, certain critiques of Maimonides. And, and some people saw kind of trying to kind of almost kind of sneak some, more Spinozistic, monistic ideas, into Judaism. So this commentary, which I know as a kind of PhD student now who's engaged in the act of translating it, this actually, I think, was an important source for many Maskilim in terms of discovering Spinoza. But, often this, led to that you started there, then you begin to read more heretical works even, and then you feel like you can't, become marginalized from the community. I mean, Reuben is actually even excommunicated, and becomes something of an itinerant figure. So he has this experience. But I would say that, Reuben's main project becomes not only to kind of rehabilitate Spinoza to a far-reaching extent, as not only this is thinker important to, philosophy writ large, but as a distinctly Jewish thinker. And also this project that he announces in this work of his from 1856 called Moreh Nevuchim Hechadash, or kind of like the new guide of the perplexed, of translating Spinoza's works into Hebrew. And it seems like he starts translating the Tractatus, doesn't get very far. Certainly that was like the more difficult work to try to, kind of reclaim, for Judaism. But, he is the first to translate the Ethics into Hebrew, in a work from, it's finally published in 1885. He also translates another work of Spinoza's that was very late in Spinoza's life, and also the translation was finished late in Reuben's life, which was a translation of Spinoza's unfinished Hebrew grammar. So, yeah, I mean, he is one of the main figures who, even though he's not, certainly, a well-known thinker today, but who plays a critical role in, rehabilitating Spinoza within not just East European Haskalah, but within Hebrew literature and culture more broadly. And we know of figures who first encounter Spinoza through Reuben's translation. It seems like, David Ben-Gurion, for example, who, becomes this avid Spinozist, that Reuben's translation was formative. Micha Berechevsky, this kind of enfant terrible, of modern Hebrew literature, in one of his journal entries describes his discovery of Reuben's translation as almost a kind of revelatory experience. Like literally, he almost describes it as a kind of like, a prophetic call. So yeah, I think Reuben was quite influential.
He has a sort of Paul on the Berdichevsky, as he describes in his jazz, a sort of Paul on the road to Damascus conversion
Yes,
experience
exactly.
of Spinoza appearing to him and guiding him in a new way. But I'm just to stick with Reuben just for a moment, because I mean, as you say, he tries to translate and present Spinoza in Hebraistic light, and does so with the title of Moreh Nevuchim HaChadash, the new guide to the perplexed. And that perplexed me, because was he insinuating that Spinoza was the new Maimonides, that for those following him in the Eastern European Haskalah, and those who are reading him, that Spinoza ought to be the guide to Jews who are seeking to make their way, let's say, philosophically in the world? I mean, did he believe it appropriate that Spinoza would become the new Maimonides for those members of that Haskalah?
I think he did. I mean, it's a good question. What the relationship, between Spinoza and Maimonides was. I mean, certainly like Spinoza famously engages, with Maimonides in the theological political treatise in terms of developing his kind of approach to reading the Bible critically and distinguishing it, from the kind of allegorizing approach that, he sees Maimonides as embodying. Others, in some ways, tried to see a certain kind of fundamental continuity between Maimonides and Spinoza in terms of the degree to which they go in kind of demythologizing God, depersonalizing God. Within the treatise, within the Moreh Nevuchim Hechadash, at least, I see Reuben as really trying to emphasize more of a contrast between Spinoza and Maimonides than a continuity. I mean, he does, deal with that to some extent, but he really is trying to see like Spinoza. I mean, it's like a complicated portrait where on the one hand, he is kind of presenting Spinoza as this, kind of exemplar of the new, of somebody who is breaking with the past. And that kind of Maimonides is more kind of like mired in it. at the same time, he really also leans into this idea, of Spinoza's philosophy as emerging from like certain kind of like subterranean currents of, metaphysical speculation or metaphysical monism, within the tradition of Jewish thought, a kind of more underground current. But, one of the things I found interesting when I first encountered this work, which was many years ago now, but, you read it and, often he's citing passages from the Zohar, even other Kabbalistic works. Reuben wrote some works that were very critical of the Kabbalah in terms of, some of what he saw as its irrationality and superstition. But nevertheless, he's also seeing elements, of kind of cosmic vision, or maybe a kind of pantheist element of it that he sees as eventuating in Spinoza.
So there's much more to discuss, but I'd like to move on to the third of sort of the flashpoints, which is the Zionist movement. And you mentioned this a bit before. You have major figures like Michael Yosef Berdichevsky, one of the great early modern Hebrew writers, along with David Ben-Gurion, and many of them, they like Spinoza. They read Spinoza, they discuss him, they identify with him. And my question is why? What is the pull? What is the attraction for Zionists, for those who are actively seeking to reconstitute the Jewish state in the ancient home? Now, why is Spinoza someone to whom they gravitate? Is it purely because of their general secularism and their sort of desire to remain within the Jewish, let's say, sphere of thought while also remaining secular? Is that their pull to Spinoza? Is it his philosophy about the laws of the Torah being essentially laws of the ancient Hebrew state? I mean, essentially, what pulls these figures into the Spinozist orbit?
Yeah, I think, it's a great question. I think there are different motivations. I mean, I think, the secularism aspect, is certainly important. Although, again, for many of these thinkers, if people have studied, let's say, the second Aliyah, which is often, associated with the beginnings of a real kind of pioneering Zionism. That on the one hand, these were often kind of radical secularists who, famously were overthrowing, the yoke of Jewish law. And yet, there was a real kind of religiosity in many ways about their thought. If you think about like a figure like Gordon, Aleph Gordon, for example, I mean, the pantheism might also be part of that. I look at like what I think are two fundamental currents, which is one, people who see Spinoza as a kind of forerunner to Zionism. Now, to a large degree, this is based on a very enigmatic passage at the end of of chapter 3 of the treatise, which comes to be extensively debated. And I doubt Spinoza really intended that, but what he holds out there the possibility, that Jews will once again become chosen, but he associates chosenness really with the kind of development of a kind of establishment of a successful, prosperous commonwealth. So, in other words, that Jews might once again, reclaim sovereignty. Although he kind of holds out this proviso of like, so long as they kind of overcome the kind of emasculating elements of their religion. So already there you see a kind of gendered element that I think is important. And certainly thinking about Zionism, as an attempt, to create, a certain kind of like Jewish masculinity as opposed to a diaspora Jew or even a Jewish intellectual, who was seen as too brainy, cerebral, weak, passive. But also those who saw that, that Spinoza may have been pointing the direction, even if he wasn't a political Zionist himself, but that, he was showing what kind of steps would be needed, for the creation of, the recreation of a Jewish sovereign state. And so there were figures like Ben-Gurion, for example, who really leaned into this. I mean, Ben-Gurion actually, he writes a very famous piece in 1953 when he's in between stints as prime minister, where he basically argues in the pages of Davar, which was the main, labor Zionist weekly, that that we need to kind of remedy the injustice done to Spinoza. And he's a little bit cryptic on whether he means a kind of point blank lifting of the cherem, or whether he's more talking about the need to kind of translate the entirety of Spinoza into Hebrew, because it's part of our kind of heritage. But in that article, he does, argue that Spinoza, in many ways, can be seen as the first political Zionist. So there are people who see kind of Spinoza as a kind of anticipator of Zionism, as a forerunner. What I also argue in the book is that, kind of one goal of Zionism was to see itself as kind of, the most kind of capacious vision of kind of Jewish culture. In other words, that it would be able to kind of embrace all these kind of marginal figures, including Spinoza, because of a kind of de-emphasis of religion and a kind of, seeing kind of nationality and culture as kind of foundational. In my book, I discuss this a kind of like national pantheism, where it's this idea that everything is a part of us. And so, it becomes part of this project of, creating, a cultural foundation and wanting to kind of bring in Spinoza as part of that.
Well, precisely, the sort of the construction of a more expansive understanding of what Jewishness is,
Yes.
and expanding beyond the borders of religion would bring in these marginal figures, especially because many of these early Zionists themselves would have seen themselves as absolutely, undoubtedly Jewish to their very core, but yet having rejected the fundamental tenets of the Jewish religion, and that may have, that was an important part of it. I would also add that there is a very small, there's almost a throwaway sentence in the Tractatus, in the TTP, famously, in which Spinoza, having said that the laws of the ancient Israelites, basically the laws of the Torah, are nothing less than the political constitution of the Israelite state, he mentioned something along the lines of, well, if the ancient Israelite state can be reconstituted nowadays, maybe the laws will apply again. And that sort of almost throwaway sentence has been taken upon, seized by many Zionists as this, as you say, this anticipation, this forerunner of Spinoza within that realm. So I want to focus on one figure who you focus on, which is Joseph Klausner, and his attempt to rehabilitate Spinoza, and in fact his public declaration, as he says, "Hutar hacherem," that the cherem has been annulled. Achinu ata, achinu ata, achinu ata. He sort of, in an almost formal, legal manner, embraces and welcomes Spinoza back into the fold. So, if you could just run us through that particular episode, because again, it is a fascinating piece of Jewish history and its connection to the opening of the Hebrew University and all that.
Yes. Right. So Klausner did this in 1927, which was I can't I'm trying to remember why. It was like one of these significant anniversary years. Maybe it was like the 350th kind of anniversary since his death. In any case, Hebrew University at this point is only 2 years old, and they decide to kind of hold a kind of commemoration there were commemorations and conferences happening all over the world, and they're going to do one at Hebrew University. And, Klausner was the keynote speaker. And it's when you read the speech in its entirety, it's actually a little bit more ambivalent than you would kind of gather from this ending, where he basically says, like you said, our brother are you, like suggesting a kind of like formal amnesty of Spinoza. Even though, earlier in the piece, he seems to side with many of those like Luzzatto, who had, criticized the attempt to kind of paper over certain fundamental differences between Spinoza's philosophy and Judaism. So I think what you see in Klausner is really kind of in some ways, these different elements. I mean, he does mention this passage, in the treatise that I've spoken about, although it's a little bit of a throw-in. It's not, the kind of crux. What seems really important to him there is kind of seeing Spinoza kind of as embodying, certain fundamental contradictions within Judaism. One of these ideas at the time of like, kind of was called in German Lebensphilosophie, like a kind of like integrated philosophy of life, which was very important at the time, and seeing kind of this kind of correspondence between Spinoza's person and his philosophy as a kind of Lebensphilosophie, building on others who had tried to kind of like see vitalist currents in Spinoza's thought. But he was also interested in trying to kind of, it was part of a larger philosophical project of trying to reincorporate, into Jewishness, into Judaism, many thinkers who were largely Platonists or Neoplatonists, and thus, somewhat pantheistic in nature, who he felt had been marginalized. So, Philo, for example, even, the Vero. I mean, complicated in that sense, even that on the one hand, he was very much part of, of the Jewish tradition, philosophical, poetic tradition. And yet he was also, discovered to have written this work in Latin called the Fons Vitae, which was really just an argument for Neoplatonism. And it was only really discovered in the 19th century that he was probably its author. But certainly not a work that was seen as, we need to translate this into Hebrew.
He saw this as necessary if we're going to open a Hebrew university in Jerusalem. So all of these, would be gathered and reintroduced under the umbrella, as it were.
Yes, and Spinoza is kind of the culmination of like some of these. He sees him as a, kind of a thinker within this larger tradition of Jewish Neoplatonism. So he wants to kind of bring them in for that. Also, it's like an interesting point he makes in that piece, is that what singles out some of the works of these figures he mentions, in particular, like the Fons Vitae or Leone Hebreo's thought, the Dialogi d'Amore, like these dialogues of love, and Spinoza's thought is that they're not primarily exegetical. In other words, he kind of makes this argument that in order to maintain a kind of continuity of Jewish thought, within the diaspora, you had to kind of have this kind of attempt to kind of root your new ideas, within kind of a reading of, classical Jewish texts. And partly what he's arguing in some ways is that, by this return to a homeland, we don't need to do that anymore. And so that's another argument he makes. So, I think it's part of a recuperation project. Did Klausner see himself as a Spinozist? I doubt it. I think no doubt another, impulse for Klausner, was this, idea of the nationalist idea of, trying to, see Spinoza as one of ours. Famously, he also gives a somewhat nationalistic reading, to another very controversial work of his on Jesus, right, on Yeshua Notzri, which is when it's translated to English becomes quite controversial. So anyway, yeah, I think these are some of the different elements of that for Klausner.
I'm afraid we're running very low on time. So one last, as a brief question to ask, which is, it can't have escaped your notice that in the last 3 or 4 decades, many Jewish scholars, especially those reflecting more generally on philosophy and religion, have become intensely interested in Spinoza. So talking about people like Harry Wolfson and Jonathan Israel, who you mentioned, Rebecca Goldstein, and Yirmiyahu Yovel of the Hebrew University. Many of these people have who are interested in philosophy both as an intellectual tradition, but also as trying to put together a coherent worldview. They've spent an enormous amount of time studying and writing on Spinoza, and there has been this kind of intellectual renaissance based around Spinoza. I mean, I assume you've noticed it as well. We're living in a new age of great Spinoza interest. So, I mean, what do you make of it? And again, is it an attempt to formulate a Judaism that is more secular and more, I'd say, philosophically attuned to modernity? Is that what lies behind this? Is this some kind of return to philosophical first principles in a Judaic sense? I mean, or is it ethnic pride that we once had a Jewish genius in the 17th century? I mean, what do you see as part as the basis of this renaissance in Spinoza interest?
Well, I mean, I'd start by saying that it's not just a kind of renaissance within among Jewish thinkers. I mean, this is part of a much broader attention, interest in Spinoza. You might see it as like kind of beginning with the kind of revival of Spinoza in French thought in the 1960s. But I think there are various aspects of Spinoza that people have really kind of gravitated to. One is, a philosophy that seems to kind of deal with this issue of the relationship between mind and body in a non-dualistic way. Even the way he understands ideas and the relations to emotions, the kind of affective nature of reason, I think, is also part of what is made important. Obviously, figures like Jonathan Israel is kind of arguing for his importance, within the Enlightenment writ large, or the Radical Enlightenment specifically, but also as the bête noire of this modern Enlightenment. I think it's hard to kind of boil it down to one element. I would say that, if we look at someone like Yovel, for example, who died about 5 years ago, Yovel was, I think, very much interested in Spinoza for what he saw as this kind of like immanentist current, this kind of like, anti-supernaturalism that kind of, led to a kind of secularism. And that, Spinoza was important to him in some ways. I mean, he was interested both in kind of like seeing Spinoza to some degree, kind of within the kind of intellectual lineage of Zionism, but also, he was interested in him as a kind of enlisting him as, part of a critique of the role that religion plays in contemporary Israel. And I mean, I should say his book, when initially published in Hebrew, I mean, was a bestseller. I mean, it was pretty shocking. But I see this also in figures like, Rebecca Goldstein as well, who has tried to, having emerged, from this religious world, kind of trying to kind of beef up a kind of secular Jewishness. At the same time, you have a kind of academic interest of many, figures who are, trying to push back against this idea of a secular Spinoza. And I would certainly put someone like Isaac Malamed, in that camp. And kind of looking, at kind of, certain like religious dimensions of their thought. And, he becomes this kind of, again, similar to the pantheism controversy, he becomes this kind of figure who's seen as as secular by many, but also as a kind of secular in a kind of like non-purely materialistic sort of a way. That there is this kind of like spiritual cosmic dimension to his thought. And I would just add that, I mean, we've seen like this rash of, interest in, like I talked about, Klausner in 1927 or Ben Gurion in 1953. You've seen attempts in recent years, to kind of hold events on whether Spinoza's cherem should be lifted. I mean, perhaps most famously in Amsterdam in 2015, where there was this whole, gathering of various scholars, some of the premier scholars of Spinoza and of Amsterdam Jewry in the 17th century, over whether the excommunication should be lifted. And then there's been all sorts of interesting things. I mean, Isaac Malamed was involved in this whole documentary that recently came out, or at least maybe it came out. I don't know exactly when it came out, but it was shown, in New York a few months ago. Where he is kind of like the guide, to this documentary on Spinoza. But, a few years ago, this whole thing that happened where, the rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, basically declared, Malamed, a kind of persona non grata, and tried to, basically, kind of quasi excommunicate him for, for kind of retrieving Spinoza in some way, which was ironic in that, actually, in Spinoza's case, it would, whatever role like some of the rabbis of the time, particularly somebody like Saul Mortera, may have played, like certainly he wasn't the one calling the shots. Already by that time, you have a lay board of trustees, board of governors was called in Amsterdam, the Mahamad, the Sephardic Mahamad. That it was lay leaders, and it was also the lay leaders of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue who basically overruled Toledano, Rabbi Toledano. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, you see even this interest in kind of like questions of can the excommunication be lifted.
So, I mean, I suppose there's nothing that sums up more Spinoza's continued relevance, as you mentioned, that there is a prominent Jewish academic going to Amsterdam to film a documentary, and the mere act of doing that is so incendiary that a rabbi of a prominent synagogue takes it upon himself to put such an academic in Cherem's for resurrecting Spinoza himself. I want to say, in closing, I'm very grateful for your summary there of the sort of the current map, especially because in our mini series that we've done here on the podcast of Jewish Ideas, we had first Rebecca Goldstein and then Yitzhak Melamed, and I'm very grateful that you summed it up in the way you did, because of course you said correctly, for Rebecca Goldstein, he is the patron saint of secular Judaism, of a Judaism shorn of all traditional religious concepts, and for her that's wonderful, and that serves for her as a kind of a guiding light. Whereas for Yitzhak Melamed is the precise opposite. He sees Spinoza as well within Jewish traditions of panentheism and well within Jewish traditions of biblical interpretation, and basically sees him as not fundamentally dissimilar from the Rambam, from Maimonides. So you do have these two completely different aspects, and thank you for coming in and tying that together, because as you see, the full range of opinions are still on Spinoza. Professor Schwartz, thank you so much for coming today to enlighten us about the reception of Spinoza. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we do hope to welcome you back at some point in the future. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.